Welcome to part 4 of working with Scouts with Autism Spectrum Disorders. My name is Roger Tate, and if you haven't watched the first 3 segments of this presentation, please go back and do that. It'll make much more sense if you do it in order. In part 4, we're going to talk about working with the ASD Scout himself, tips for working with him in a camping environment and a meeting environment, and also for helping his boy leaders work with him as well. Now let's talk about working with the ASD Scout himself. Basic techniques. First of all is that your Scout is going to need very direct instruction in how to behave in social situations, and with repetition. You're going to be doing this over and over again. So if he's behaving in a way that socially just doesn't work, you need to try and take him aside, and you need to explain him in very direct terms what it is he's doing, how it's affecting others, and what he needs to do differently. For example, you want to tell him, "Look, John, when you stand really close to someone, it makes them uncomfortable with you, and they feel creepy and they don't want to be your friend. I know you want to be friends with them, so you will be able to do that if you can stand at least 2 feet from them when you're talking to them." That's an example of giving them direct instruction of how to behave in a social situation. And the key thing is you need to explain why. In other words, you need to explain in concrete terms what the behavior is, in concrete terms how it's making the other person feel, and why, and exactly in concrete terms what they need to be doing differently. Second aspect of working with the Scout is a lot of autism spectrum people have a hard time maintaining eye contact when they're talking to you. If you think about that visual overload and those neural pathways we talked about earlier on, what happens is them focusing on your face creates such an input to their brain that they cannot process and listen to you. So their natural instinct is to break eye contact so they can listen more carefully and pay attention to what you're saying. But on the other hand, eye contact in our society, if you're not making eye contact, that can be perceived as being deceitful or being disinterested. So what I suggest for you to do as a leader is seek eye contact, but don't demand it. So if the boy isn't looking at you, you can. And one alternative, if it's being hard on him, is just go ahead and tell him the information and then ask him questions to verify that he understands it, even though he's not looking at you. Or if he's a little more mature and you can work with him and it's a good moment, you could say, "John, I want you to practice looking at me, because when you get to be an adult, you need to be able to look at people while they're talking to you." And the reason is because if you don't look at people, they tend to think you're lying to them or that you don't care about what they're saying. So let's practice this together. So you can seek it, encourage it, but don't demand it to the point that you cause an emotional situation with that boy. Third thing is to recognize, I say, don't confuse lashing out as meanness. An important thing to recognize with an autism spectrum person is that they have to use so much of their brain to intellectually manage their social environment. There's nothing that comes intuitively for them. So when I talk about them faking normal or pretending to act normal, they're having to use a lot of their brain power to do that. So imagine how tired you would be at the end of a long work day, and how you might be more irritable or more prone to be cranky because your brain's tired. That's the way these kids are all the time. They just don't have as much margin of reserve as other people do. So they are prone to lash out and get angry when in situations where others wouldn't, or to get emotional and cry and melt down, because they just hit their anxiety limit. The point for you as a leader is to don't confuse that kind of a meltdown with something moral. They're not mean, they're not lazy, and there again, don't confuse distraction as laziness. Often, like lack of eye contact, they may look distracted. They might be doodling or doing something off to the side during a merit badge class, but you'll find if you ask them questions, they may very well have learned everything you were saying to them. Now, often what I find in scouting, though, is there are times when you simply have to look at it to learn it, and that's what I do with my son. Say, okay, this is something you have to look at, so I need your eyes on this, watch this. And I make a point of it. If it's something that can only be learned visually, I just make a point of getting their eye contact for that part, but not forcing it at other times. Naturally, you want to, with any scout, encourage them to try something new or challenging, but be ready to back off. Once you've been around a boy for a while, you'll be able to kind of sense when he's on that ragged edge of melting down or being in emotional distress. Your goal is to not take him that far with it. Yes, you want to press. Yes, you want to challenge, but you need to be ready to back off at any time. Remember, in scouting, you can always come back and do this at a later time. There's nothing that has to be done right at that moment that you can't try again later. And last, and this is true with any scout, is praise and reward their efforts. One of the things that could throw you off about an autistic scout is that while he might seem kind of cold and detached and unemotional, that's not what's really going on. These children have emotions like others do, they just don't express them in the same ways. They respond to praise and encouragement just as much as a neurotypical scout. Scout meetings. Your scout meeting environment, when we talked about transitions in the earlier section, one way you can help a boy manage the transition from one activity to the next is with foreshadowing. That's where you announce in advance what the activities are going to be, what order they're going to be in, and you prep the scout for the changes that are going to come place. So if you know that you're coming towards the end of a time for a certain activity, you might just tell the group, says, okay, in a little while we're going to go from this task to that task. And then when it comes time to get to that task, you're going to have an opportunity to make that transition and more likely be able to be successful with your autistic scout. Another opportunity in scout meetings is to use your Scoutmaster Minute time or your Cubmaster Minute to build empathy in all your scouts. You can promote tolerance, you can promote looking at things from someone else's viewpoint with all your scouts, and that will help your autistic scout as well. Third thing I'll point out, when we talked about advancement earlier, about advancement requirements, I think you need to look at where a boy is at early on in his scouting career and be ready to adapt advancement requirements. If you think that he isn't going to be able to do something and you're pretty sure he's not going to be able to do a particular advancement requirement, you want to start getting the paperwork in process early to get those alternative advancement requirements approved, because often it has to go up the chain at least to the District Advancement Committee and maybe the Council Advancement Committee for approval. And I'm not going to talk about all the details on that. That's a subject for another discussion. But just be aware that it takes time, so you want to plan in advance. You need to be aware of the sensory environment of your meetings. For instance, if you've got a boy who is very visually distracted or overwhelmed, take a look at your scout room. Do you have a lot of things hanging on the walls? Well, maybe what you do is you move all the stuff where you've got one clear wall, and then you face the boys that direction for the meeting to cut down on the visual environment. That's a way you can adapt your sensory environment. If you've got noise issues, then try to take the activity outdoors where the sound can dissipate, where that loudness can just go out into the breeze. So be aware of it, and there's ways you can adapt that. When it comes to instructing a scout, one of the things that especially comes up at summer camp is that a lot of times you're trying to cram a merit badge into maybe 3 or 4 hours of classroom instruction, and at summer camp you often have a teenage scout who is the merit badge instructor and doesn't have the skills of a professional educator or frankly a sensitive parent sometimes. This can cause problems with your autistic scout because they don't organize information very efficiently into steps. They tend to not write down assignments. So one way you can adapt with that in your summer camp environment is to frankly have shadow with an assistant scoutmaster, somebody you can kind of check in about what needs to be done out of class and what the homework is, and help guide the autistic scout through getting his tasks done. He may be perfectly capable of doing everything, but he still may need nudging to get things done. Last point about scout meetings is that if it's necessary, you may have to involve a parent in the scout meeting. And the reason for that is because just that sensory antenna. A parent's probably going to be far more alert to situations that are going to set his own son off at a scout meeting and cause issues, and also probably be better equipped to take the scout aside and, if possible, maybe even need to take him home because that particular meeting is getting to be overwhelming. So if you need to involve parents to help manage behavior with your autistic scout, I would say do it, but be thoughtful about this. The boy will grow more from not being bailed out the first instant something goes on. Camping. In the camping environment, things are a little different with autistic scouts. One of the puzzling things that is somewhat unique to autistic scouts is that they are prone to wander off from a campsite without telling anybody, without even recognizing the danger from it, or simply get lost, get confused about directions and go off a particular way and not realize that they're getting away from the campsite. So it is absolutely vital, especially with autistic scouts, that you really enforce the buddy system. I know a lot of troops will get casual about the buddy system, especially when they're at a Boy Scout facility, but you really can't let slack happen on the buddy system when you're working with an autistic scout. Second point when camping is to manage chaos rather than ignoring it. Often when it comes time to pitch camp or to tear camp down, you've got boys going all different directions, often yelling instructions to one another, and frankly, it's chaotic, and autistic scouts don't handle chaos well. They're going to either shut down or get angry or possibly melt down if there's just too much noise, too much chaos going on around them. You as a leader can manage this situation, though. When you see the situation getting chaotic, that's when it's a time to start tapping the shoulders of your patrol leaders and your senior patrol leaders to start calming things down, possibly slowing things down, and providing a more calm environment. Everyone will benefit from it. But work through your patrol leaders to get that accomplished. Third point is beware of too many chiefs. It's also a thing that happens on campouts is 3 boys may go off to pitch a tent together, and all of them are giving instructions to each other, and nobody's really being a leader and nobody's being a follower. That's a situation that can really be a problem for an autistic scout. Again, if he's getting too much input from too many places, he's more likely to shut down than be effective. Often the solution to this is simply to have the patrol leader designate one of the 3 as the leader for the tent pitching activity. There's no rules that say you can't create informal and temporary leadership positions to accomplish tasks. So take advantage of that to both build leadership skills in your boys and provide a less stressful environment for your autistic scout. And the last thing about camping is, and this is really true for almost any scouting event, is always have an alternative activity in mind for the boy who can't perform the high adventure skills. Some of your autistic spectrum scouts aren't going to be able to do, from motor skills standpoint, some of your more technical high adventure activities. But you don't want them excluded, so try to have a way of having a toned down version of it or an alternate activity on that outing where that boy can participate. Boy leaders. This is really important. When you can, educate your boy leaders about autism spectrum disorders, especially your older boy leaders. If they're aware of what the autistic scout is dealing with, they're far more likely to be effective with them in their own way. Second thing about training boy leaders is teach them to use very direct skill training with that autism scout. He's going to need very specific instructions and possibly things broken down into much smaller steps to be effective. It's a simple adaptation that your boy leader should know. There again, learning to give very specific instructions and concrete instructions. Rather than saying go pitch a tent or go cook dinner, you might need to break it down and say, okay, go get water, go start the stoves on going, something more specific and more concrete. Your boy leaders need to understand that the ASD scout has a hard time expressing himself and that they need to take extra time to listen. Your boy leaders will need to learn how to recognize and defuse stress. That autistic scout is going to be building up, and once you know what the warning signs are, you'll be more effective in stopping things before they get out of hand. And last but not least is delegating. Encouraging boy leaders to delegate to subordinate leaders the chance to lead activities, and when it's appropriate, delegate to the autistic scout. This brings us to the end of our presentation on working with scouts with autism spectrum disorders. I hope by now you've realized that working with these kids can enrich your life, and it will certainly enrich theirs as scouts. There's a lot of good to be had for everybody. If you have any more questions about this material, please feel free to get in touch with me. My email address is rogertate@att.net. That's ROGERTATE @att.net. Thanks for your time.